The wind across the Texas panhandle didn't simply blow, it gnawed. It carried teeth made of red grit and dry heat, chewing at the wooden siding of Larkspur until the paint curled back like dead skin. It was 1874, or maybe 1875. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Time behaved differently out here, where the law was thinner than the paper in a prayer book. The town of Larkspur clung to the edge of Apache country, like a burr on a stray dog living off cheap whiskey-nervous gossip, and the silver coins men tossed onto saloon tables for other men's heads. Varrik Stonehawk reined in his gelding on the ridge above the settlement. The horse was a stocky roan, built for endurance more than speed, though it carried enough of both to keep a man alive. Varrik was young, maybe 24 or 25, but his eyes held the weight of too many winters turning into hungry springs. Trail dust clung to him like a second shirt. He had spent the season scouting for the army work that paid in hard coin, but carved pieces off a man's spirit. He'd led bluecoats through canyons, pointed out water holes, and game trails, all while keeping his expression flat when they spoke of destiny ownership and the future of the land. He tipped the brim of his hat, studying a buckboard wagon rattling down Larkspur's main street. The scrape of iron wheels over gravel carried sharp in the thin air. He didn't care for this town. It stank of ambition gone sour and dreams that hadn't bathed in weeks. But he needed supplies, and he needed to hear what the wind murmured in places where men drank and bragged. He had a debt to settle not in coin, but in blood. An old debt tied to a winter lodge burned to the ground 2 years back. The man responsible was down there somewhere hiding behind false storefronts and polite lies. Varrik brushed a thumb over the scar on his forearm, a jagged line tucked beneath his sleeve. He was done with the warpath in the old way. He didn't aim to strike at every white man he saw. That was a fool's road ending with his people starving on reservations. But certain men who made cruelty their profession, that was different. That was gardening. You pulled the weeds so the valley grass could grow. The sun was sinking, throwing long, bruised shadows across the dust. Varrik nudged his roan forward. The horse picked its way down the slope, hoofbeats softened by scrub. He would ride in quiet. He would listen. And he would remember that the promises of white men dissolved like morning mist the moment the heat rose. Inside the parsonage, Sienna Valehart sat by the window. She was 22 in age when most women on the frontier were already mothers of 3 or buried under a wooden cross. Sienna was neither. She was the Reverend's daughter, a title that felt less like honor and more like wearing a wool coat in the dead of summer. She held a needle and thread repairing a tear in her father's Sunday vest. The rhythm soothed her hands, but her mind wandered far beyond the glass toward the endless line where sky kissed earth. She had been taught that the horizon was danger, that it was where the Apache roamed, where girls who lost their virtue drifted and never came home. Sienna. Father Orrin Valehart's voice cut into her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, tall, rigid, wearing his piety like armor. He loved her, she knew that, but it was a love tangled with fear of what the world would say about him if she stumbled. "Jackson Thornwright will be joining us for supper at 6, he said. "Make sure the roast isn't dry this time." "Yes, Father," Sienna answered softly. It was the voice of a dutiful girl, a contained girl. "He's a good man," Orrin continued, stepping into the room to adjust his cuffs. "A man of the law. He can offer you safety. In times like these, a woman cannot ask for more than a roof that won't burn, and a man who carries a badge. Safety." The word tasted stale. Sienna looked down at her hands, pale, unmarked hands. Hands of a woman kept indoors. Jackson Thornwright. had damp palms and eyes that slid toward her bodice when he thought she wasn't looking. He spoke of land deeds and fence lines and looked at her the way a rancher appraised a heifer before auction. "I know, father," she murmured. "Don't look so sullen," he said gently, patting her shoulder with a hand heavy enough to pin her in place. "It's for your own good. Dragan Crowfell is in town again. You know what happens when his riders get restless. A woman alone is a target. A deputy's wife is untouchable." At the name Dragan Crowfell, a chill crept along Sienna's spine. His name drifted through Larkspur like a curse. Crowfell called himself a bounty man, but that title was too neat. He was a butcher who'd discovered the profit in selling the pieces. "Is he staying long?" Sienna asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Until he clears out the vermin, as he calls them," Father Oren said, turning back toward his study. "Stay clear of the windows tonight, Sienna. Evil has a way of walking on two legs in a town like this." Father Oren Valehart's footsteps faded down the hallway before she dared look outside again. Far to the south, past the last livery barn, stood the old signal outpost, little more than a wounded relic now. A skeleton of charred beams and stone, blackened by some forgotten blaze. One half of its roof had caved in, leaving the rest leaning like a tired old man. Folks whispered it was haunted. Sienna feared no ghosts. It was the living that tightened her chest. That ruined outpost was where townsfolk slipped secret messages, sometimes a lover's folded note, sometimes a warning meant for a single pair of eyes. A wild urge rushed through her to rip off her stiff, high-collared dress sprint until her lungs burned, race toward that broken station, and keep running until she reached a place where no one knew she was a reverend's daughter. But she didn't move. She steadied herself, lifted the needle. She was Sienna Valehart. She was dutiful, she was safe, and she was suffocating by inches. By the time Varrik Stonehawk reached the edge of Larkspur, the sky had drained into a deep, bruised purple. He tied his horse behind the livery, flicking a coin toward the stable boy, who stared at him with the kind of suspicion only fear could teach. Varrik didn't spare him a second glance. He shifted his gun belt. A Navy-issue revolver hung at his side, its grip worn smooth from years of work. A knife rested hidden at the small of his back. His boots thudded across the boardwalk, each step heavy and deliberate. The air smelled of cold soot and frying grease. He shoved through the swinging doors of the Gilded Spur, the largest saloon in town. Noise slammed into him like a fist. An out-of-tune piano was being beaten half to death in the corner, trying to pretend it was playing something lively. Men packed the bar shoulder to shoulder, their laughter more like barking. Varrik claimed a table in the back where no one could come up behind him. He ordered whiskey and let it sit in his hand-eyes, sweeping the room. That's when he saw him. Dragan Crowfell sat at a wide round table, near the front holding court, like a self-crowned king. A broad-shouldered brute dressed in a coat expensive enough to feed 3 families for a year. His beard hid most of his face, but not his pale, pitiless eyes with all the mercy of winter. Around him lounged his cavalry, the Crowfell riders, men with the dead, look of those who'd kill their own kin if the price was right. "I'm telling you," Dragan boomed over the din, "civilization is a garden. You want roses, you pull up the weeds. These Apache," he spat the word like poison, "don't understand fences, don't understand property, so we teach them." With a rope, one of his men jeered. Dragan laughed, a hollow, rasping rattle. "Fire and rope, that's the only language a savage speaks." He lifted his glass. "I've got investors coming in 3 months. They expect grazing land, green empty land, not buffalo pits, not camp circles. I intend to deliver." Varrik's hand tightened around his whiskey. Memory struck him like a blade, burning hide, collapsing lodges, the scream of a woman under falling beams. This was the man. At the bar, Reva Bramble was scrubbing the counter with a rag that had survived too many years. Her hair was the color of rusted iron, her face mapped with lines carved by hard laughter and harder days. She ran the gilded spur with one hand and kept a shotgun under the counter with the other. She noticed everything, said nothing. Usually she acknowledged Varrik. She knew the kind of man he was, though they'd spoken only a handful of words. Tonight, she barely shook her head. A warning. Not here. Not now. Varrik dipped his chin. He wasn't here to spark a war. He was here to listen. Dragan slammed his palm on the table again. "And it ain't just the savages out on the plains," he roared. "It's the sympathizers here among us, those who trade with them, those who think peace is possible." A hush rolled over the saloon. Even the piano stuttered to a stop. "They rot this town from the inside," Dragan whispered dramatically, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "We need to send a message that Larkspur is a white man's town, a clean town." "Who are you thinking of, Mr. Crowfell?" a trembling merchant asked. Dragan smiled a cold, vicious curl. "Oh, I've got someone in mind. Someone too friendly with the enemy. We'll have ourselves a little ceremony soon." A purification. Behind the bar, Reva Bramble dropped a glass. It shattered like a warning shot. The glass hit the floor with a sharp crack, slicing through the hush that had fallen over the saloon. "Clumsy hands," Reva Bramble muttered as she crouched to pick up the shards, but Varrik Stonehawk saw the tremor running through her fingers. Varrik threw back the rest of his whiskey in a single swallow. The burn crawled down his chest, but the cold knot in his gut didn't budge. A purification. He knew exactly what Crowfell meant by that. It meant a hanging. It meant someone would die just so Dragan Crowfell could flex his power, and so the town could pretend it was safe. Varrik rose and slipped toward the door, keeping his head low. As he passed the bar, Reva leaned over as if wiping a spill near him. "They're planning it for tomorrow night," she whispered, lips barely moving. "At the old signal station. They're hunting for someone to blame. Anyone will do so long as it scares the rest." "Who?" Varrik murmured, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "I don't know," she breathed, casting a fearful glance toward Crowfell's table. "But I heard them say they want a spectacle. Someone spotless makes the sin look darker." Varrik stepped outside into the night. The cold cut like teeth. He looked toward the signal station, its silhouette jagged against the stars like a broken tooth in the valley's mouth. A show. A warning. He walked to his horse. He could ride away back to the deep canyons where the water ran sweet and white, men stayed scarce. This wasn't his battle. Let these people devour themselves. But then he remembered the vow he'd made over the charred ruins of his friend's lodge. No more lessons. He swung into the saddle. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. He would watch the signal station. If Crowfell wanted to send a message, Varrik intended to read it, and if the spirits allowed, he'd change the ending. Back at the parsonage dinner with Jackson Thornwright was pure torment. The roast was dry despite Sienna Valhart's best efforts, and the deputy chewed with his mouth open while boasting about the new ordinance against stray dogs. "Shot 3 today," Jackson said, wiping grease from his chin. "Nuisance animals. Mr. Crowfell says we ought to clear the streets for good. Mr. Crowfell seems to run this town now," Sienna said before she could stop herself. Her father sent her a warning glare. "Mr. Crowfell is a businessman, Sienna. He brings capital. He brings order. He brings hangings," she fired back. The deputy stopped chewing. His eyes narrowed. "Justice Miss Valehart," he said. "He brings justice. There are folks in this territory who don't respect the law. They need to learn consequences." "And who decides those consequences?" Sienna asked quietly. You or him, Sienna. Father Oren Valehart's voice cracked like thunder. Apologize to the deputy this instant. You speak of things you do not understand. She looked at both men, her father terrified of losing his standing, and the deputy terrified of being anything but a tyrant's loyal dog. I apologize, she said, tasting ash. I have a headache. May I be excused? She didn't wait for permission. She shut herself in her room and locked the door. She paced the narrow floor, 4 steps one way, 4 steps back. A cage. Her life was a cage. She went to the window. The signal station was only a shadow, now darker than the night wrapped around it. She pressed her palm to the cold glass. I won't end up like this, she whispered. I won't be a deputy's wife nodding along while they shoot dogs and hang men. She had no money, no horse, no weapon. But something long buried, something rebellious was beginning to crack open inside her. Outside, Varrik settled into a patch of juniper a few hundred yards from the signal station. He wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and waited. The wind shrieked through the half-ruined structure, making it sound as if the wood itself were crying. He watched lights in town blink out one by one, until only the saloon and the jail glowed faintly in the dark. The world felt like it was holding its breath. Varrik closed his eyes, listening the sift of earth, the scuttle of a lizard, the distant call of a coyote. He didn't know that less than a mile away, a girl stared into this same darkness, praying for a storm to break the choking stillness. She didn't know his name. He didn't know hers. But the threads of their lives were already pulling toward each other, and fate was tightening the knot. Their fates were being dragged together by the rough hands of Dragan Crowfell, tightening into a knot that would either bind them close or string them up. Night sank deeper, and the wind refused to rest. It scraped over the land like something sharpening its claws, readying the ground for new blood. Varrik Stonehawk checked his revolver one final time, spinning the cylinder. The click echoed sharp, decisive final. He was ready. Whatever daylight dragged into this valley, he intended to face it, standing. Inside the tavern, laughter had withered into low, grim murmurs, men whispering violence into being. Crowfell leaned back in his chair, struck a match, and lit a cigar. The smoke rose in a slow, sinister curl, writhing toward the ceiling beams like a waking serpent. Tomorrow, Crowfell told his rider's voice soft, but carrying tomorrow, we spark a blaze, they'll see clear to the Red River. At the bar, Riva Bramble, wiping down the last glass, shivered. She stared at the door Varrik had walked through moments earlier. She hoped he was long gone. She hoped he was wise enough to run. But she remembered his eyes, cold-focused, relentless. Those were not the eyes of a man who fled. They were the eyes of a hunter. God help us all, she whispered, blowing out the saloon lamp. The town of Larkspur, now sleeping under its new name in the dark hearts of the Dust Haven folk, did not rest peacefully. It tossed twisted ground its teeth. And at the center of its restless dreams, the abandoned signal station waited its charred ribs, eager to swallow a fresh story in flame. The stage was set. The players were already moving. And the final beat of the first act would end in fire. Morning didn't rise warm. It crawled up pale and bruised, a gray light bleeding across the horizon and coating the sagebrush in a thin frost. Varrik hadn't slept. He spent the night listening to the wind carve through the valley and the unsettling quiet smothering the town. As first light kissed the mesa tops, he mounted his roan and rode toward the signal station. He told himself he was only scouting the trail, making sure nothing blocked his way out of this cursed territory. But the tightness in his gut said otherwise. When the station came into sight, the wind stilled, as if the land itself were bracing. The burnt frame stood like a skeleton of failed promises. And then Varrik saw it, something new hanging in the ruin. He pulled hard on the reins, leather groaning in his grip. Suspended from a jutting beam was a shape. It spun lazily, a grotesque pendulum in the thin morning air. A person, hands bound behind their back, a burlap hood over their head. Below the dangling body, the double doors of the station were barred shut. On the scarred boards, someone had scrawled in thick black charcoal words meant to scream louder than any living throat, Comanche lover. The letters were neat, precise. Carefully shaped the hand of a clerk or a school teacher, someone who cared about penmanship even while writing hatred. Varrik dismounted. His boots crunched on the frost-hardened earth. He didn't run. Running was for prey. He walked with the controlled, predatory stride of someone used to facing death head-on. As he neared the swaying body, he saw the boots, small, fine leather, now ruined and scuffed. A woman's boots. He looked up. The rope creaked under her weight. And then a twitch. A faint, desperate hitch of the chest. She wasn't dead. Not yet. Varrik moved. He yanked the knife from the small of his back, the dull morning light catching the blade. He scrambled up fallen stone, reaching for the rope. He didn't know who the woman was, but he knew the cruelty of the knot. It wasn't a hangman's knot meant to break a neck. It was a slip knot. A slow killer. A torture. With one brutal slice, he cut the rope. He dropped the knife and caught her as she fell, her weight slamming into him, sending him stumbling. He held on, absorbing the impact with his knees, arms locked tight around her narrow waist. She was frighteningly light, like a bird whose bones were meant for flight, not pain. Varrik laid her on the cold stone of the porch, fingers working fast to loosen the noose carved into her throat. He yanked the burlap hood free and froze. The face was ghost-pale, lips tinted blue. Blood matted the wheat-colored hair around her temple. A pistol butt or a rock had left a wicked gash. It was Sienna Valehart, the Reverend's daughter, the girl he had glimpsed through the window, the one the town polished like a delicate ornament of virtue. Her eyes were shut. Her breathing ragged, shallow, like brittle leaves scraping together. "Breathe," Varrik ordered, voice low and harsh. "Come on. Breathe, white girl. Crack." The rifle's report echoed a beat before the bullet tore up a spray of red dust, just inches from Varrik's boot. He didn't bother looking toward the shooter. He recognized the trick. They'd left the bait breathing just long enough to pull the wolves out of hiding. He was the wolf, and the trap had just sprung tight. Varrik swept Sienna Valehart into his arms. She groaned raw, broken sound, her head lolling weakly against his shoulder. Another rifle shot cracked through the air, this one sparking off the stone wall just above him, spraying grit down on both of them. "Hold on," he growled. He ran for his horse. The roan was spooked, dancing sideways at every echo of gunfire, but when Varrik let out a sharp, low whistle, the animal froze, ears pricked forward. He heaved Sienna across the saddle horn and swung up behind her in one smooth, practiced motion. Then he drove his heels in, not fleeing straight out, but circling around, using the burned-out station as a shield between them and the sniper perched somewhere on the ridge. The horse launched forward, muscles firing like coiled springs. They scrambled down a slope of loose shale, sliding more than running, a storm of dust rising behind them. Varrik held Sienna tight against him, feeling the fragile, frantic flutter of her heartbeat through his forearm. They rode hard for a full 10 minutes, zigzagging through a maze of sandstone outcroppings and thick juniper clusters, until the gunfire faded into the vast silence of open plains. But Varrik knew better than to stop. Dragan Crowfell never sent just one man his riders traveled in packs. Sienna shifted in front of him, dragged upward from the dark by the bone-jarring rhythm of the gallop. She thrashed weakly, her fingers clawing at his arm. "No," she rasped, her voice shredded raw from the rope. "No, be still," Varrik murmured near her ear. "I've got you." She turned her head, eyes glassy with terror and fever. She didn't see him. She saw ghosts, the men who had dragged her screaming into the night. "Don't take me back," she choked, gripping his shirt with desperate strength. "Please don't take me home." Varrik frowned. A preacher's daughter should have been begging for her father, not running from him. "You're safe," he said. "I'm getting you away from the bullets, not delivering you back." She cried out, tears carving pale tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Father," he let them. Her voice cracked. "They said they'd fix me. They said they'd fix me right." The word slammed into Varrik harder than any rifle shot. Fix her. He knew that term. It was what men did to biting dogs to horses that wouldn't break, not to daughters. Her father hadn't failed her. He'd handed her over. "I'm not taking you home," Varrik vowed, voice low, and carved from stone. He turned the horse toward the river, toward broken country, where deep canyons split the land like scars. There was a place he knew, a narrow fissure, hidden in the cliffside curtains of willow and cottonwood, concealing its sunlight not touching the water until noon. When they reached the canyon's shelter, Varrik slid from the saddle and lifted Sienna down. Her legs buckled instantly. He caught her before she hit the ground and carried her to a soft patch of sand beneath the rocky overhang. Only now, safe from gunfire, did the full damage come to light. A brutal, angry welt ringed her throat where the rope had eaten into her skin. A bleeding gash split the side of her head. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing bruises shaped unmistakably like fingers. Varrik knelt beside her. He had to clean the wounds before rot set in. He dipped a strip of cloth torn from his own undershirt into the icy stream. "This is going to sting," he warned. Sienna drifted somewhere between waking and unconsciousness. When the cold cloth met the raw skin of her neck, she flinched, releasing a thin whimper. Varrik's hands were calloused, but his touch was careful, gentle, in a way few men ever saw in themselves. He rinsed the blood from her hair, working slowly through the tangled, wheat-colored strands. He washed the grit from the rope burn. It wasn't tender. It wasn't romantic. It was survival, pure and unvarnished. He wasn't touching her to claim her. He was touching her to keep her alive. She wasn't something to desire. She was a flame nearly extinguished. Yet as he wiped the dirt from her cheek, something fierce rose in his chest, a protective fire he hadn't felt in years. She was broken, yes, but she was breathing. "Who did this?" he asked, though the truth already burned in him. Sienna's eyes fluttered open. For the first time, they latched onto him, really seeing him. She took in his dark skin, the long hair, the knife strapped at his back. She should have screamed. She'd been raised to fear men like him, the so-called savages whispered about in her father's sermons. But she didn't scream. She looked at him with exhausted, aching clarity. "Crowfell," she whispered. "And everyone else?" Her eyes closed again. Her hand slipped limp into the sand. Varrik sat back on his heels, wringing out the blood-soaked cloth. The stream carried the diluted red away, swirling pink as it drifted downstream. Back in Larkspur, the air crackled with a dark, eager tension. Dragan Crowfell stood on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, watching his riders mount up. A cup of coffee sat easy in one hand, a cigar burning between the fingers of the other. He did not look like a man whose plan had backfired. He looked like a man who believed the new hand he'd been dealt was better. "She's gone, Mr. Crowfell, the sniper," reported voice trembling. A Comanche Crowfell repeated, rolling the word on his tongue, as if testing its weight. "You're sure saw the hare. Saw the horse." Crowfell smiled, an expression cold enough to curdle blood. "Perfect." Sir, the sniper swallowed. If she had died on the rope, she'd be a martyr. Crowfell took a slow sip of his coffee. "A martyr," he echoed. "Exactly. Folks cry over martyrs." The preacher would have had to shed tears. It would have been messy. He raised his cigar, pointing toward the blackened signal station where the slur Comanche lover was still visible, even from town. But this is cleaner. She's been taken by a savage, or better yet, he let the silence stretch. She ran away with him. He turned to the men gathering around him, faces twisted with fear, curiosity, and a hunger for violence. "Listen close," Crowfell thundered. "The girl has been taken or she's fled. Either way, she's with the enemy now." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I'm putting a bounty on her head." The street stilled. $500 to the man who brings her back alive. He let the number sink in, let greed bloom behind their eyes. She will stand before this town and confess. Every last sin. His smile sharpened. "We need her breathing." "She is the message." "What about the Indian someone called?" "Kill him," Crowfell said without hesitation. "Bring me his scalp and I'll pay another $100. The men erupted cheers, curses, boots pounding. $600 was a fortune enough to buy a homestead or drink oneself into oblivion for years. Inside the sheriff's office, Father Orrin Valehart sat hunched in a wooden chair, head buried in shaking hands. "You can't do this, Clayton," he whispered, voice cracking. "She's my daughter. You said it would only frighten her. You said you'd cut her down before she was hurt." Crowfell stepped inside, shutting the door. The roar of the crowd dulled to a low rumble. He placed a firm hand on the preacher's shoulder and squeezed until Orrin winced. "I'm saving her soul," Crowfell said softly. "And I'm saving your reputation." He leaned closer. "Think. If she returns saying she was kidnapped, then she's a victim. The town pities her. She's forgiven." His tone shifted silk over steel. "But if she stays gone, if she chooses him, then she destroys you. Destroys your church." Father Valehart lifted his head. His eyes were rimmed red hollow with years of brittle righteousness. "She's just a child," he pleaded. "She's a woman who made a choice," Crowfell corrected. "Now you make one." His voice was a blade. "Do you want to be the father of a girl who ran off with a savage, or the grieving father whose daughter was stolen?" The room felt airless, choking. Finally, the preacher bowed his head. "Bring her back," Valehart whispered. "We will, Crowfell promised, and we'll wash her clean." He stepped outside sunlight, catching the edge of his cigar. He motioned to his scarred Lieutenant Silas. "Get the dogs," Crowfell ordered. "And tell the boys to ride hard. They've got a head start, but she's hurt. They won't get far." Back in the canyon, the sun climbed higher, baking the red cliffs. Varrik stood at the narrow entrance of the crevice, eyes fixed on the horizon. A dust cloud rose large, fast-moving. Riders. Many of them. He glanced back at Sienna. She slept fitfully, pain twisting her face. He could leave her melt into the Badlands, vanish where no posse could ever track him. He could return to his people and the life that still made sense. But he stared at the ugly bruise circling her throat, at the way her hands clenched even in sleep as if still fighting. She had said, "Don't take me home." Varrik checked the load in his revolver, touched the ammunition pouch on his belt. 40 rounds. Not enough to kill them all, but more than enough to make them bleed for every step they dared take. He filled his canteen, walked back, and knelt beside her. He woke her gently. "We've got to move," he said. Sienna's eyes fluttered open. The fever burned hotter now, where Sienna whispered. "Away from here," Varrik said. "Can you ride? I don't know. You have to." He pulled her upright. She swayed, pain ripping through her, but she didn't collapse. She grit her teeth, something fierce flashing in her eyes, a steel Varrik hadn't seen before. "I'll ride," she said. Varrik nodded. He lifted her onto the roan and swung up behind her, one arm circling her waist again. This time her weight sagged back against him, not from trust, but from pure necessity. Her skin burned with fever through the torn fabric. "They're coming," Varrik said, nudging the horse forward into a trot. "Let them come," Sienna murmured, staring at the canyon walls ahead. "I'm not going back to that cage." They rode deeper into the Badlands, hooves striking sparks from stone. Behind them, the dust cloud billowed larger, the beginning of a dark, relentless storm rolling over the prairie. The hunt was on. And here in the fierce heart of the Texas Panhandle, two people born enemies were bound now by the only law that mattered in the West, the will to survive one more day. The alcove was cold. A shallow cup in the sandstone that blocked the wind but offered little comfort. Sienna Valehart woke to the smell of wood smoke and the metallic tang of her own blood. For a moment she lay frozen, the rock pressed hard against her hip, her mind drifting in that gray void between nightmare and waking. She waited for the church bell, for the heavy stomp of her father's boots in the hallway. Instead, she heard the slow scrape of steel drawn across a whetstone. Memory slammed into her chest, the rope tightening around her throat, the jeering faces men she'd grown up with, the slur carved onto the station door, Comanche lover. She bolted upright with a gasp clutching her neck. Nausea surged. She scrambled backward until her spine hit the rock wall, breath hitching in short, terrified bursts. She looked down. Her pale blue Sunday dress was torn at the hem, stained with grit and mud. She felt filthy. She felt ruined. Varrik sat near the mouth of the alcove, his silhouette cut sharp against the dimming sky. He wasn't watching her. He was sharpening his knife strokes, steady and unhurried. A small fire glowed beside him, shielded by ringed stones, so its light wouldn't escape the canyon. Sienna curled her knees to her chest. She'd been raised to believe men like him were monsters creatures who took white women to break them body and soul. She waited for him to turn, to claim the prize the town had already accused her of giving. Varrik slid the knife into its sheath. He picked up a tin cup beside the fire and extended it toward her, never closing the distance more than necessary. "Drink," he said. His voice was deep, steady, nothing like the harsh, broken cadence she expected. Sienna stared at the cup. Her throat burned raw inside and out. She reached with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing his. He didn't grab her. He didn't leer. He simply released the cup the moment she had hold of it. Why, she rasped. Her voice was shredded, barely sound. "Why am I here?" "Because the other option was a rope around your neck," Varrik said. He looked at her, then dark eyes steady, unreadable, but empty of the hunger she'd seen in Jackson Thornwright's gaze. "You're safe here," he added. "Woman, I don't own you. I'm not the one who tried to hang you." The words struck harder than any slap. "I don't own you." She'd never heard such a thing from her father, from the deputy, or from any man in the Dusthaven folk. To them she was property, to guard, to bargain, to cast aside when stained. "They wrote," Sienna's voice cracked. She couldn't finish the sentence. "They wrote it on the door, everyone saw. Ink on wood. Varrik said, his tone dismissive. It washes off. Blood doesn't. It's not true, she whispered, tears spilling hot and furious. I never touched you. I never touched anyone. I know. He stirred the fire with a stick. So why'd they want you dead? He asked quietly. A town doesn't hang a preacher's daughter over a lie unless the truth scares them more. Sienna lowered the cup. The firelight slowly thawing the numbness in her body, until every hurt sharpened. She looked at Varrik. Truly looked at him. He was young, not far past her own age, yet there was a weathered stillness about him that felt older than the hills. I found the book, she whispered. Varrik lifted his gaze. What book? The ledger. Sienna murmured, her voice scraping through the bruising. Deputy Jackson Thornwright left it in the parlor back when he was courting me. He figured I was too simple to read numbers. Thought all I cared about was threading a needle. She drew a breath that whistled through her swollen throat. It held a list, family names, directions to homesteads near every water source, and beside them, dates that haven't come yet. And prices. Varrik went rigid. The fires. His tone made it clear he already knew the answer. Yes. Sienna nodded. Dragan Crowfell and the deputy. They hire men to dress like the Emberthorn Apache. They torch barns, poison wells. Then Dragan buys the land from the widows for pennies, and Thornwright files the deeds. I heard them laughing about it. Her hands tightened. I heard them say they needed the path cleared for the railroad survey. And then they caught you. I tried to take the page, Sienna admitted, shame burning hot in her cheeks. I wanted to show my father. I thought he'd listen. I thought... She swallowed. I was naive. But Thornwright caught me, twisted my arm, told my father I was unhinged. Her eyes shut tight. He told him I was sneaking out to meet a savage, said I was tainted, said the only way to save the town's soul was to make an example of me, and your father believed him. My father, Sienna said, bitterly believes whatever keeps his world neat and easy. He looked at me, and then at the deputy, and he chose the lie. A daughter who's a whore is a tragedy he can preach over. But a daughter who proves the lawmen are criminals, Varrik spat into the fire. So they brand you a lover of the Emberthorn Apache. Dead, you're a warning. Alive, no one heeds a woman accused of lying with the enemy. Clever trap. I'm ruined, Sienna whispered. Even if I survive, I'm ruined. You're breathing, Varrik said, rising to his feet. That's a start. But we can't stay here. You've got a silk dress and I've got 6 bullets. We need supplies and we need to know Dragan's next move. Sienna shook her head. There's nowhere to go. They'll have watchers on every road. Except one. Varrik replied. We're going back to Larkspur. The return ride felt like descending into the pit. They left the horse 2 miles out, hidden in a dry wash thick with scrub oak. Varrik moved with a ghost-like silence that unsettled her. He didn't walk. He glided across the ground. Sienna tried to mimic him, but her boots crunched against gravel, and her breath rasped too loud. They reached the edge of Larkspur an hour past moonrise. The town was wide awake. Lanterns swung on porches and knots of armed men roamed the streets, guns resting casually in their hands. The air reeked of dust and self-righteous fury. Varrik drew Sienna into the shadow of a livery stable. Stay close, he whispered. If they spot us, don't run. Hit the ground. I'll draw their shots. I'm not letting you die, Sienna hissed back, shocking herself with the fierceness in her voice. Varrik cast her a side glance, amusement flickering briefly. Then try not to step on dry twigs. They slipped through the alleys, weaving past barrels and stacked crates. They were headed for the Gilded Spur, and Sienna silently cursed the madness of it. That saloon was the town's rotten heart. But Varrik insisted that Riva Bramble was the only soul in this territory whose loyalty belonged to her own conscience, and nothing else. As they rounded the general store, a door swung open. Light spilled across the dirt, straight into Sienna's face. She froze. In the doorway stood Elowyn Frost, the seamstress, who had fitted Sienna's Easter dress 3 months back, the same woman who used to slip her bits of hard candy when she was little. Elowyn held a bucket of kitchen scraps, her eyes widened lantern light reflecting in them as she took in the torn dress, the bruised neck, the grime. Sienna begged her silently, eyes pleading, breath caught in her chest. "Please, you know me." Sienna's voice trembled her plea barely more than a breath, Mrs. Gable's mouth opened her chest, filling with the kind of air a woman takes in right before she screams. Varrik moved. He didn't lay a hand on her. He simply stepped out of the dark, the blade at his hip catching the faintest glint of lantern glow. His face was stone cold, carved unmistakably dangerous. He lifted a finger to his lips. The warning didn't need words. Mrs. Gable's jaw snapped shut. Her expression twisted, not at Varrik, but at Sienna, full of disgust so sharp it made Sienna flinch. She backed inside and slammed the door. The lock slid home with a hard, metallic click. "She's going to tell them," Sienna whispered, shaking. "In 10 minutes she'll tell her husband," Varrik answered. "So we have 5. He grabbed her hand, his first time truly holding it, and pulled her into a run. They reached the back door of the Gilded Spur. Varrik didn't bother knocking. He slipped his knife beneath the latch and lifted it clean, easing them inside the storeroom where kegs and flour sacks towered around them. The door to the main saloon swung open. Riva Bramble stepped in with a tray of empty glasses. She froze. Her hand went straight to the hidden pocket in her apron, the one where Sienna knew she kept a derringer. "You out of your mind, boy," Riva growled low. Then her eyes landed on Sienna. The hardened edge softened instantly, turning pained. "Lord help us. Look at you, child. We need help," Sienna whispered, stepping forward. Riva listened to the roar of laughter spilling from the saloon floor. "Dragan Crowfell's out there," she muttered. "Buying drinks. Celebrating the hunt. We need Sienna started." But Riva cut her a look and nodded once. "The cellar trap door's under the pantry rug. Go. Now." The cellar was damp, close, and thick with the smell of earth and vinegar. Riva brought down a lantern and a plate of cold beef and bread. She saw the bruising around Sienna's throat and unleashed a string of curses that would have made Father Oren Valehart drop to his knees in prayer. "He's planning a spectacle," Riva whispered. "Dragan's calling for a moral trial tomorrow at noon. Says if you're not found, he'll condemn you in absentia, burn an effigy, then seize your father's land as restitution for the so-called sin you brought on the community." "He wants the land," Sienna murmured, gripping the bread but unable to eat. "It was never about me. It's the creek running through the parsonage lot." Varrik wasn't touching the food. His attention was locked on a paper pinned to a crate, a fresh notice offering reward for Sienna. "This writing," he muttered, tracing the ink. "The heavy strokes, the curl on the R." "Dragan wrote it," Riva said. "He brags about his penmanship, claims he taught school in Ohio before the war." Varrik pulled a folded scrap from his pouch, weathered leather, wrapped around a piece of parchment. He set it beside the reward poster. 2 winters ago, he said, voice turning icy, before soldiers burned my brother's lodge, we found this nailed to a tree, a warning to leave or die. I kept it. The handwriting was identical. Every arrogant flourish, every heavy stroke. "He's been at this for years," Varrik said, realization hitting like a blade. "He's not just a bounty hunter, he engineers the fear. He builds the fire, then sells the cure. He provoked the war that killed your family," Sienna whispered. "And now he's doing it to his own people." Riva rubbed her temples. "Honey, Half the town suspects something's rotten, but they're scared. And the other half, they want Dragan to be right. Makes the world easier to swallow. They want you gone, Sienna. Not out of hate, out of guilt. Folks will kill before they'll confront their own shame. Varrik stood abruptly. We've got what we came for. We're leaving. Leaving for where Riva asked. The North Pass is snowed in, West Varrik replied. Into the high country. That's suicide, Riva said. Crowfell's got trackers. I'm better, Varrik said simply. Then he turned to Sienna. Are you ready? Varrik asked quietly. It's going to be cold, and it's going to be rough. Sienna rose slowly. The food had steadied her stomach, and the anger coiled inside her had settled into something sharper, steadier. Her gaze drifted to the reward poster bearing her name. $500. That was the measure of her life to them, a sack of coins. She turned to Varrik. He stood there waiting, not pushing, not pulling, simply giving her the space to choose. Varrik, she said. It was the first time she'd spoken his name aloud. It felt strange on her tongue, yet solid like something she could lean on. If we run, then we're nothing but prey, she murmured. Just rabbits. Rabbits survive, Varrik replied. I don't want to only survive, Sienna said, her voice trembling but rising in strength. I spent 22 years being safe, 22 years being the good girl behind the parlor window, and they still put a rope around my neck. She stepped closer until she could smell the smoke and leather clinging to him. She lifted her chin to meet his dark eyes. I'm not fleeing into the mountains just so Dragan Crowfell can steal the land my father built, she said. If I have to die, Varrik, then I'd rather die choosing my fate, not as some lesson they preach to children. Varrik watched her for a long, still moment. Then a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, like a man realizing he'd just been handed a weapon he never knew existed. Then we don't run, he murmured. We hunt. Riva Bramble looked between them, the wild scout and the preacher's daughter standing beneath the lantern glow of her cellar. She let out a breath and shook her head, half amused, half resigned. You two are going to tear this whole town apart, Riva said. Someone has to, Sienna replied. Above them, heavy footsteps creaked across the floorboards. Dragan Crowfell was upstairs. The monster was in the house. But in the darkness below, the hunted had decided to become the hunters. Varrik snuffed the lantern. Let's move. They slipped back into the night, and everything between them had shifted. They weren't escaping anymore. They were marching toward a war. The weather struck with the fury only the high plains could conjure. What began as sharp wind turned into a full-born assault ice, slashing sideways, thunder cracking open the sky as hail the size of musket balls hammered the earth. Varrik and Sienna had abandoned the open trail miles back, chased uphill over a spine of jagged limestone. Their lone gelding, terrified by thunder and stinging ice, fought Varrik's grip. We can't cross the ridge, Sienna shouted, the wind swallowing her voice. We'll be torn apart, Varrik yelled back, leaning over her and shielding her face with his shoulder. There. Sienna pointed to a dark split in the canyon wall just barely visible between sheets of white hail. They scrambled upward. Mud and ice slicked the rock beneath them. Varrik's boot slipped, his footing vanished, and he fell hard, sliding across a coil of old, rusted, barbed wire left by some long-dead settler. The metal tore through his side. He grunted low and rough, but pushed himself up, dragging the reins and guiding Sienna until they tumbled beneath the shelter of a shallow overhang. Not a cave, barely more than a dent in the rock, but it kept the hail from tearing them apart. They pressed themselves against the back wall. The gelding shivered at the opening, blocking most of the wind. Varrik slumped against the stone hand pressed to his ribs. When he pulled it away, his palm was dark. You're hurt, Sienna said. Her nerves still thrummed with fear from the chase, but the sight of blood jolted her into focus. Wire Varrik muttered, clawing at the torn buckskin at his side. Rusted. It's nothing. It's not nothing if it festers. Sienna snapped her voice, startling her with its firmness so different from the meek tones she'd always used in the parsonage. She knelt beside him. Let me see. Varrik eyed her warily in the dimness. He had tended his own wounds since boyhood, or endured some grinning emberthorn Apache healer slapping herbs on him while mocking his carelessness. He was not used to the careful touch of a white woman who smelled faintly of lavender and fear. I don't have water to waste, he warned. We have ice, Sienna said. She reached toward the mouth of the overhang, scooping a handful of hailstones. They stung her skin as they melted in her palms. She tore a strip from her petticoat, another sacrifice of the fine dress that had been shredded by her ordeal, and soaked the cloth in the slush. This will burn, she said softly, echoing the same warning he'd given her earlier that day. Varrik let out a dry, humorless laugh. Do it. She cleaned the wound. It was ugly, a ragged tear carved across his ribs, but not deep enough to strike anything vital. As she worked, Varrik didn't flinch, though she felt the muscles in his stomach jump beneath her fingers. It was an intimacy she never imagined outside the whole world seemed bent on freezing them alive. But in this cramped pocket of shared warmth, she was touching the skin of a man her father had always called a godless devil. He wasn't a devil. He was warm. He was real. And he was bleeding because he'd thrown himself between her and the storm. You've got steady hands, Varrik murmured. Not bad for a girl who fainted at the sight of a roast. I never fainted, Sienna corrected, pulling the bandage tight. I just looked away. A lady is supposed to look away from ugly things. And now he asked. Sienna eased back on her heels, resting her palms on her knees. She looked at the bloody cloth in her hands, then at the storm raging just beyond the overhang. Now I think hiding is how ugly things survive, she said quietly. If we look at cruelty straight on, then we're forced to fight it. Varrik studied her. There was no firelight, only the sharp, stuttering flashes of lightning illuminating her face in harsh white bursts. She looked exhausted. She looked beautiful, like the storm itself. Why do you live this way? Sienna blurted out. Always running, always outside the walls. Varrik adjusted himself against the rock, a soft grunt catching in his throat. Walls don't keep people safe, he said. Walls just make 'em easy to slaughter. You saw that town. They're scared of everything, the wind, the dark, me. Fear makes men cruel. And you aren't afraid I'm afraid of dying without a song, he said quietly. Afraid of forgetting who I am. But I'm not afraid of the wind. Wind is just air in a hurry. He nodded toward his own bandaged side. Freedom ain't doing whatever you want. That's what children think. Freedom is knowing nobody holds the pen that writes your name. Nobody marks your skin but you. Sienna wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. The cold gnawed through her torn dress. They wrote on me, she whispered. They carved lover on the door. And my father, he wrote daughter on me, but he meant property. Her cheeks flamed with a heat that had nothing to do with weather. I'm 22, Varrik, and I've never been with a man. He looked at her, thrown off by the sudden confession. That's your business, he said. No. Sienna answered, voice shaking. You don't understand. In my world, it's everyone's business. It's why I was valuable. It's why Jackson Thornwright wanted me. I was a sealed letter. If the seal is broken, the letter is worthless. She swallowed hard. I spent years terrified of losing it, terrified of being spoiled, so terrified that I let them put me in a cage. I'm a virgin, Varrik, and right now sitting here in the dirt, I hate it. I hate that it's the only thing they think I have to offer. I hate that my virtue is the rope they use to choke me. Silence settled heavy between them. Dense, charged. Varrik shifted closer, not to claim, but simply to offer warmth. He opened his heavy buffalo hide coat and held it out to her. "Come here," he said. "You're freezing." Sienna hesitated only a breath. Then she stepped into the circle of his arm. The coat wrapped around her like a shelter. It smelled of wind leather wood smoke, a scent that was unmistakably dangerously male. She leaned into him, careful of his injury. His heat radiated through her, seeping into her trembling bones. "You're not a letter," Varrik said softly, his voice rumbling through her. "And you're not a coin to be spent. You're flesh and blood. You're the woman who walked into a cellar to arm herself against an army." Sienna turned her face toward him. Their mouths were inches apart. She could see the flecks of amber in his eyes, feel the rasp of his stubble when lightning flashed. The storm, outside the posse. Dragan Crowfell, the cold felt miles away. There was only the heat of him, the way he looked at her, not as a saint, not as a ruined thing, but as a woman. Her heart pounded loud as thunder. Sienna hesitated. "If I go back—" She stopped, breath catching. "If I go back, I want to walk in as myself, not the girl they think they own." She lifted her hand, fingers trembling as she touched the strong cut of Varrik's cheekbone. Varrik went still. He didn't pull away. He didn't lean in. He simply existed there, unmoving, as if any shift in his body might shatter the moment. Then Sienna kissed him. It wasn't graceful. Their teeth clicked. She was shaking from cold and fear, and something far more dangerous. But then Varrik's hand slid up, steady and warm, cradling the back of her head. His fingers tangled gently in her tangled hair. He deepened the kiss, slow, deliberate, carrying the taste of rain and desperation. A soft sound escaped Sienna's throat, half whimper, half release. She pressed closer, desperate to bury her frozen body in his heat. The terror she'd been raised on, the whispered sermons, the warnings about sin, evaporated beneath the simple truth blooming inside her. This felt right, terrifyingly right. She pulled back by a breath, her forehead resting against his, and the weight of what she'd begun hit her. "You'll ruin me," Sienna, whispered voice trembling. Half an accusation, half a realization. In her father's eyes, in the eyes of the Dusthaven folk, this was the end of her old life. Varrik let out a low, rough laugh, the sound vibrating through her chest. "Then I'll ruin myself too," he said quietly. He kissed her again this time, without hesitation. He drew her fully beneath his heavy coat, wrapping them together in a cocoon of warmth and darkness, while hail battered the earth outside. Sienna's hands fumbled at the buttons of his shirt, clumsy but determined. She chose him. In the middle of a storm that wanted them dead, she chose fire over fear. The hail kept hammering the stone, relentless, deafening. Inside the alcove, the world shrank to the rhythm of breath, the rasp of skin against skin, and a woman reclaiming a body that had been held hostage far too long. The morning sun was blinding. It reflected off the drifts of hail, still wedged into the shadows, like spilled diamonds. The sky above was a brutal, polished blue, scrubbed clean by the storm. Sienna woke first. Her limbs were stiff, aching from cold and exhaustion, but she felt strangely light. The suffocating wool cloak of shame she'd worn her entire life had fallen away in the storm. She looked beside her. Varrik slept with one arm thrown protectively across her waist. She didn't feel ruined. She felt forged. She sat up and tugged her shredded dress into place, but did not attempt to smooth or fix it. Let it stay torn. Let the world see her as she was now. She watched dust motes dancing in a thin shaft of sunlight, and her thoughts sharpened, cold, precise. The ledger, the names, and her father. Varrik stirred awake, instantly alert as a hunting cat. He looked at her, and for a moment she feared regret might shadow his face. It didn't. Instead, he looked at her with a quiet recognition, an understanding that something had changed in her and in him. "The storm broke," Varrik said, sitting up with a slight wince as his side pulled. "Yes," Sienna murmured. She turned toward him, the truth clicking into place. "Varrik, I know where the proof is." He reached for his boots. "The ledger you saw?" "No." Sienna shook her head, her mind racing. That ledger was Crowfell's private notes. Illegal, yes, but he could claim it was just numbers, just projections. She leaned closer, eyes bright with realization. But to steal land, actually steal it, he needs a legal transfer. "The courthouse is in the county seat," Varrik said. 3 days on horseback. "Not the courthouse," Sienna said, her voice hardening. "The church. The parish registry." Varrik froze, boot halfway on. "Explain." "My father," she said, bitterness thickening her voice. "He records deaths. He records last wills. If a widow donates her land to the church or signs a deed before dying, my father witnesses it. He stamps it." She grabbed Varrik's arm, urgency crackling between them. "Don't you see Crowfell burns them out, but he needs the paper trail to look clean. So he makes it look like they sold the land before the fire, or left it to the church. And then the church sells it to him. Your father is the key," Varrik said, his face darkening. "He's the lock," Sienna corrected. "But there's someone else." She drew a shaking breath. "Crow Reddick. The drunk, the one sleeping behind the stables. He was a medic in the war. He acts as coroner when the doctor's away. He signs the death certificates. If Crowfell's riders shot a man and torched the house to hide the bullet wounds, then Crow Reddick is the one signing off the death papers. If he wrote accidental fire on those certificates, he's already part of the lie. He knows every last piece of it." Varrik Stonehawk rose to his feet, tightening the buckle of his gun belt. The leather groaned softly, a sound that always meant trouble was coming. "Crowfell is holding a trial at noon," Varrik muttered. "He plans to burn whatever is left of your name. Then we show up," Sienna Valehart said, standing to meet his gaze. "We find Crow Reddick before noon. We get that registry. If we go back empty-handed, we're dead. If they spot us, they open fire." "No questions," Varrik warned. "They're searching for a panicked girl and a wild Apache," Sienna answered coldly. She bent to pick up Varrik's knife from a flat stone. The blade caught a sliver of light. Her tangled hair, dirt-streaked cheeks, and steady eyes stared back at her. "They won't find that pair anymore." She turned and pressed the handle toward him. "Cut my hair." Varrik froze. "Your hair's your pride. Your father calls it your crown." "It's a handhold for anyone trying to drag me down," Sienna said. "Cut it. I'm done with vanity." Varrik gathered the long golden waves in one hand. For a heartbeat, he searched her eyes, making sure she meant it. She did. Steel rasped sharply. The braid fell to the cave floor, a shimmering rope severed from everything she used to be. Sienna shook her head, the rough-cut ends brushing her shoulders. She looked younger, sharper, and far more dangerous. Now she said, "Let's go ruin Dragan Crowfell." They stepped out toward the waiting horse. The whole world between them had shifted. Yesterday, Varrik had dragged a wounded girl up a mountain. Today, he was riding beside a partner. 4 hours until noon. 4 hours to turn a manhunt into a reckoning. By midday, the sun beat straight down, white-hot and merciless, bleaching every color from Larkspur, leaving the town square jammed shoulder to shoulder. The heat held the air hostage, thick with sweat horses and the metallic smell of coming violence. In the center stood a makeshift gallows, a beam lashed to 2 corral posts, a single rope swaying in the quivering heat. Dragan Crowfell stood on a crate beneath it, dressed in a fresh coat beard, trimmed, wearing the mask of a respectable leader. At his side, Father Sienna Valehart clutched his Bible so tightly his knuckles had turned bone-white eyes fixed on the dirt, rather than the rope. "We do not gather for vengeance." Crowfell thundered voice rolling across the crowd and bouncing off wagon wheels. "We gather for purification. This town is rotting at its core, inviting the wild Apache to our very doorstep." Fear rippled through the crowd. Fear was easy to steer. At the far edge behind the general store, dust shifted. 2 men lay flat on the livery stable roof, hidden by the parapet. Varrik checked the cylinder of his Colt Navy. Beside him, Blue Crow, an Apache warrior, older and wiser. Face carved like old wood, watched through a brass spyglass. Smoke signals had brought him down from the hills just in time to meet Varrik before everything fell apart. "They're tight," Blue Crow murmured. 3 on the ground, deputy on the platform, Crowfell in the middle. Varrik's jaw locked until it hurt. They had reached Crow Reddick's shack at sunrise, but Mrs. Gable had sold them out. Deputies waited in ambush. They dragged Sienna screaming into the street while Varrik was forced back by rifle fire. He hadn't abandoned her. He'd retreated to gather the only force that might save her. "No killing unless we have no choice," Varrik said quietly. "If this turns into a bloodbath, she dies in the middle of it." "Then we make them look somewhere else," Blue Crow replied, adjusting his sights. The jailhouse doors burst open. Sienna Valehart was dragged into the square. A wave of gasps swept the crowd like wind through dry grass. She no longer resembled the sheltered daughter people remembered. Her fine dress hung in shreds, smeared with canyon mud. Her once prized hair, her crown as her father called it, had been chopped. Brutally short. Jagged strands brushed her jaw, sharpening her features and leaving her looking raw and unbreakable. Her wrists were bound behind her. She didn't cry. She walked with her chin high, eyes sweeping the sea of faces she had grown up among. What she found wasn't comfort. She found judgment. She found pity. She found fear. Jackson Thornwright shoved her forward, making her stumble at the base of the crate. Behold, Dragan Crowfell thundered, jabbing an accusing finger at her. "This is the cost of defiance." She chose the bed of a savage over the purity of her own race. She conspired to bring the Emberthorn Apache down upon us. He swung toward the Reverend. Reverend read the scripture. "Tell them what becomes of the harlot who betrays her people." Father Sienna Valehart shook like a leaf. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. "Read it," Crowfell hissed, hand drifting toward the pearl grip of his pistol. She shall be burned with fire," the Reverend whispered. "For she has played the whore in her father's house." "Louder." "Father," Sienna said, not screaming, but slicing through the choking heat like a blade. The Reverend lifted his eyes. Tears streaked down his face. "Look at me," Sienna said. "Not at him. Look at me. I'm your daughter. I mend your vests. I read to you. You are ruined," he choked. "No, I am free, and you're the one in chains." Crowfell struck her hard. His backhand sent her sprawling into the upright beam of the gallows. The crowd erupted, some gasping in outrage, others roaring approval. "Enough talking!" Crowfell bellowed. "String her up! Let this be a warning to any woman who wanders from the path." Jackson Thornwright grabbed the noose and stepped toward her. Crack! A rifle shot split the air. The rope in Thornwright's hand snapped clean in half, the noose dropping harmlessly into the dust. Emberthorn Apache. Someone screamed. Panic exploded. The Dust Haven folk scattered, diving behind wagons and troughs. Crowfell's riders spun, rifles raised, searching for the shooter. Varrik Stonehawk leapt from the livery roof to the top of a supply wagon, then to the ground. He didn't move like a fugitive. He moved like a storm breaking loose. He cut through the chaos, using confusion as his ally. Above Blue Crow stayed in position, firing again. Not at men, but at the lantern over the jailhouse door, shattering it. More shots tore up dirt at deputies' feet, forcing them to scatter and leaving a narrow corridor for Varrik to charge through. He reached the platform. Thornwright spotted him and drew, but Varrik was quicker. He didn't fire. He slammed the barrel of his revolver into Thornwright's temple. The deputy collapsed like a dropped grain sack. Varrik seized Sienna, spun her behind the thick oak post, and slashed through the ropes binding her wrists. "You came back," she breathed, gripping his shirt. "I told you," he said, scanning the square. "I ruined myself too." "There," Crowfell shrieked. "Kill them both. $500 to the man who drops them." Rifles snapped toward them. Varrik tackled Sienna to the ground, covering her with his body. He raised his revolver, ready to die if it bought her seconds. "Hold your fire!" The shout boomed, echoing across the square, not from the lawmen, but from the saloon. Reva Bramble stepped out of the gilded spur, a double-barrel shotgun resting open over her arm. But it wasn't the weapon that stopped everyone. It was the man she dragged out beside her. Crow Reddick, unshaven, reeking of gin, but wearing his old cavalry coat, brass buttons polished bright like a man forced awake by duty he'd long tried to forget. He carried a weather-worn leather satchel. "Anybody pulls a trigger," Reva Bramble barked, "and I'll blast open that whiskey barrel and let this whole town burn before sundown." Threatening the liquor worked better than threatening lives. Several barrels dropped. A few rifles lowered a fraction. "Mr. Crowfell Crow," Reddick shouted, voice trembling but gathering force as he stepped straight into the heart of the killing ground. "I've got something that belongs to you." Dragan Crowfell's eyes narrowed to slits. "Get that drunk out of here." "I am a drunk," Reddick said, stopping 10 feet short of the scaffold. "But I also served as a surgeon in the Army of the Potomac. And I know the difference between someone who burned in a fire and someone who was shot before the flames ever touched him." A silence fell so deep, even the horses froze. Reddick opened his satchel. He pulled out a stack of papers, charred at the edges, soaked and damaged, but still readable. "I kept the records," he announced to the Dust Haven folk. "The Jameson family, the Miller family, that Creek boy. Crowfell told you they died in Emberthorn Apache raids. Said they burned in their beds." He lifted a jagged piece of lead. "I dug this out of the Jameson boy's spine. A .44 slug, standard for bounty hunters. Not an Apache arrow." "He lies," Crowfell shouted, face flushing with a sick, mottled rage. "He's drunk on Indian whiskey." And this Reva Bramble stepped forward, pulling a charred wooden scrap from her apron. The burned letter R was still visible, the remnant of Comanche lover, scorched into the signal station door 2 years earlier. She held it beside a sheet of paper, the threatening note Varrik had given her. "Look at the handwriting," she yelled. "Same curls, same pressure, same man wrote both, and it wasn't any Apache." Gasps rippled outward. "He started the war," Reva said. "He hired men to dress up like tribesmen, torch your homesteads, scare you into selling your land for pennies." Sienna Valehart stepped forward. Varrik tried to stop her, but she shook him off and walked into the open. Not a prisoner now, but an accuser. "He never cared about my virtue," she said, her voice cutting through the rising heat. "He wants the creek running through our acreage. He wants water rights for the railroad." She turned to her father. "Father, tell them about the registry. Tell them how he made you change the dates so it looked like those deeds were signed before people died." Father Orrin Valehart stared at his daughter, at her chopped hair, bruised skin, and the new fire in her eyes, then at Dragan Crowfell, who glared at him with a viper's hatred. The Reverend rose slowly. His legs shook, but he stood. "It's true," he said. The quiet confession cracked through the square like thunder. "I forged the dates. He said it was for the town's good. Said we needed the railroad." Dragan Crowfell roared, backhanding him off the crate and into the dirt. Something in the crowd snapped. The spell of fear broke beneath the weight of evidence. Men who'd been ready to hang Sienna lowered their rifles. Anger surged, visceral, rising like a prairie fire. "You used us!" a farmer shouted, stepping forward. "You killed my brother, blamed it on the Apache, and bought his farm for $10. Crowfell looked around, panic blooming. His hired guns shifted uneasily. Not loyal soldiers, just men who could do math. Blue Crow still held the roof. Varrik Stonehawk was already on the ground, and the town was waking up. "You fools!" Crowfell shrieked, pressing back against the gallows post. "I gave you order, I brought civilization, and this is how you repay me, believing a whore and a drunk." His gaze locked on Sienna. If he couldn't keep the land, he would claim blood. "You first," he snarled. He leveled his pistol at Sienna's chest. The mob couldn't reach him in time. Riva couldn't lift her shotgun fast enough. Varrik didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think of the law, or the crowd, or the price. He stepped fully into the open, drawing Crowfell's eye for a split second, but Crowfell didn't waver. His barrel stayed fixed on Sienna. Varrik inhaled once, finding stillness in the storm. He fired a single shot. The bullet did not strike Crowfell in the heart. Varrik Stonehawk wasn't an executioner, he'd never been one. He was the kind of man who stepped into the line of fire only to shield someone else. So when he squeezed the trigger, the bullet tore into Dragan Crowfell's right hand, shattering bone, and the pearl-handled pistol he clutched. Crowfell shrieked a thin, broken animal sound as the weapon spun from his grip, his fingers erupting in a spray of blood. He crumpled to his knees, clutching what remained of his hand to his chest. The square fell under a sudden, crushing silence. Varrik stood motionless, smoke drifting from the end of his barrel. He didn't lower the gun. He didn't speak. He simply stepped forward, placing himself between Sienna Valehart and the man who had tried to kill her. His presence alone was an iron barricade. Nearby, Jackson Thornwright stirred dazed, reaching blindly toward his fallen revolver. A rifle crack snapped from the rooftop, Blue Crow's warning shot kicking dust just inches from Thornwright's nose. The deputy froze, lifting both hands slowly into the air. Around the square, the Crowfell riders exchanged uneasy looks. Their employer lay bleeding in the dust, while the Dust Haven folk, no longer mesmerized by fear, were arming themselves with fence posts and stones. Slowly, one by one, the hired guns holstered their weapons and backed away with raised palms. Sienna stepped toward Crowfell. She looked down at him, this man who once ruled the town with sermons and threats. Now he whimpered like something small and mean. "You called me a savage's lover?" she said quietly, her voice steady as a church bell. "But he's the only man here who didn't try to kill an unarmed woman." She turned toward the Dust Haven folk. For the first time, they truly looked at her not as a stain on their conscience, but as someone who survived what they almost sanctioned. "Go home," Sienna said. "The spectacle is finished." Riva Bramble climbed the gallows steps, drew a knife from her belt, and sliced through the last rope, still holding the noose aloft. The loop of hemp fell into the dust like a dead rattler robbed of its strike. Father Orrin Valehart struggled to his feet. He stepped toward his daughter, hands trembling, his voice breaking. "Sienna, child." She drew back, standing closer to Varrik, not out of fear, but out of choice. Her look wasn't hateful. It was sorrowful, distant, almost unbearably calm. "Go home, father," she told him. "You have more praying to do than any man here." Varrik eased his revolver into its holster. His hand settled lightly on Sienna's shoulder, steadying the tremor that finally reached her knees as the last of the adrenaline drained away. The wind picked up swirling dust around the fallen noose and the man bleeding beneath it. The town of Larkspur stood in stunned, breathless stillness, its belief in divine judgment replaced by the violent, undeniable truth of human corruption. The fever had broken. What remained were scars no sermon could heal. The dust in Larkspur's square hung thick, a shimmering haze under the noon sun, carrying the bitter mix of gunpowder guilt and a mob's collapsing certainty. Dragan Crowfell no longer resembled the self-appointed steward of justice. He was a torn heap of expensive wool curled around a ruined hand, shuddering and gasping. Rusk's whimpering, high, thin, pathetic was the only sound for a long moment. Then Jackson Thornwright made his play. He staggered from the platform, hands raised high, face slick with fear. I was following orders, he shouted, voice cracking. Crowfell ran everything. I just filed the paperwork. I didn't know about the fires. I swear on my mother's grave. But the Dusthaven folk didn't move to defend him. A few minutes earlier, they'd been eager to hang a girl simply because fear had told them to. Now, with truth laid bare by a drunk medic and a saloon keeper, their righteousness shriveled to shame. They stared at the ground, at the sky, anywhere but at the deputy who'd gladly watched a rope hover over a young woman's neck. Two older townsmen owners of the livery and dry goods store stepped forward. They didn't look proud. They looked exhausted. They seized Thornwright by the arms. "That's enough," Jackson, the livery owner, said harshly. "You'll sleep in one of your own cells until the circuit judge rides through next month." "And him!" Thornwright squealed, pointing at Crowfell. The storekeeper looked toward Crow Reddick, the man once known only as a drunk, sprawled behind the stables. "Doc Reddick," he said. "Patch him up. We want him alive for the hanging." Crow Reddick nodded. His hands still trembled from the rush of it all, but his eyes were sharp now, sober with purpose. He kneeled beside Crowfell and opened his bag. Crowfell recoiled, eyes fixed on Varrik, who still stood like a sentry with Sienna tucked safely behind him. "He won't shoot you again," Reddick muttered as he reached for bandages. "He fires to stop a man, not kill him. Can't say the same for you." Varrik eased the hammer of his revolver down with a soft click, his gaze never leaving Crowfell. Varrik Stonehawk eased his revolver into its holster, the leather groaning in the sudden stillness. He didn't spare the Dusthaven folk a glance. His eyes were fixed on Sienna Valehart. She stood beside the gallows post, trembling though the heat pressed down like a heavy quilt. The burst of adrenaline that had carried her through the noose and the mob was draining fast, leaving her breath thin and her knees unsteady. Her gaze drifted to the rope, lying twisted in the dirt. It looked like a rattler someone had finally stepped on. A shift of movement drew attention. Father Orrin Valehart hauled himself upright on the platform. The bruise swelling across his cheekbone had turned a deep, blooming purple. He looked out at the congregation he'd thundered at for 20 years, except now he stood below them, stripped of authority, a man who had traded his own child for his comfort. He climbed down from the crate. He stumbled. No one reached out to catch him. He walked across the dust toward Sienna. Varrik stiffened his hand, drifting instinctively toward his gun, but Sienna touched his arm lightly. "It's all right," she whispered. Father Orrin stopped 3 feet from her. He took in her hacked hair, cut ragged with a hunting knife, and her bruised neck still scraped raw from yesterday's rope. He glanced at Varrik beside her, the Emberthorn Apache warrior he'd spent years condemning from the pulpit. "Sienna Valehart," he managed. His voice was a rasp of broken faith. "Father," she answered. There was no anger in it, just exhaustion deep and old. "I thought—" He swallowed. "I thought I was keeping wolves from our door, but I opened it wide." "You were the wolf," Sienna said softly. "You and half this town. You tore apart your own because you were afraid to starve." Father Oren shut his eyes. Tears cut tracks through the dust on his face. His shoulders sagged. The proud vestments of his office, usually stiff and authoritative, hung loose like a costume that no longer belonged to him. "I can't undo what I signed," he whispered. "I can't wash the registry clean. I can't swallow back the scripture I read." "No," Sienna said gently. "You can't." He looked toward the crowd. A shudder ran through him before he reached up and unfastened his clerical collar. The white strip came loose in his hand. He let it fall into the dust. Then he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his daughter. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't holy. It was clinging desperate like a drowning man who had finally understood the weight of his sins. He buried his face in her shoulder and sobbed the harsh, heaving kind of crying a man can't control. Sienna did not soften. She didn't stroke his back. She didn't whisper forgiveness. She simply stood letting him feel that she was alive, solid, but no longer his to break. "I'm leaving," she murmured at his ear. Father Oren pulled back. He saw the iron in her expression, the steel the canyon and the storm had forged. "Where will you go?" he asked, voice trembling. "To a place where my name means what I say it means." He nodded, accepting it without scripture or defense. Then he turned his eyes to Varrik. The preacher and the warrior regarded each other in a long, quiet moment. No handshake, no bridging of cultures, just the raw recognition that the ground beneath their lives had shifted forever. "Keep her safe," Father Oren said quietly. "She keeps herself safe," Varrik replied. "I only walk beside her." The Dusthaven folk parted silently as Sienna and Varrik headed toward the gilded spur. A few men removed their hats as she passed respect, offered far too late to matter. They moved past the wagons, past the church doors, now shut tight, and into the cool dimness of Riva Bramble's saloon. Inside, the weight of the ordeal hit them both like a dropped anvil. Riva locked the door behind them and flipped the sign to closed. She pulled out 4 whiskey glasses, 2 for shaking hands, 2 for shattered nerves. Her fingers were steady again now that the shotgun was back beneath the counter. "Drink," she said. "Doctor's orders." Sienna sat at the nearest table. Her hands shook so badly she needed both to lift the glass. The whiskey scorched all the way down. A clean, sharp fire rolled through Sienna Valehart's chest, hot enough to chase away the last trace of the gallows shadow. "They won't keep Dragan Crowfell locked up forever," Riva Bramble warned, leaning her hip against the bar. "He's got money tucked away in St. Louis. Men like him always do. Give him a month, 2 at most, and he'll be walking free." "He'll walk free," Crow Reddick agreed, polishing his spectacles with a grimy rag. "But he's finished here, the town's scene behind his curtain. Once his purse dries up, so does the fear. After that, he's nothing but a cripple with a mean reputation." Varrik Stonehawk turned toward them. "And you too?" he asked quietly. "When Crowfell's friends come riding, or when the Dusthaven folk remember they hate truth-tellers more than liars. What then?" Riva shrugged. She looked around her scarred, saloon-battered tables, cloudy bottles dust in the corners that refused to be swept. "I've run this place 15 years. I know every secret this town's tried to bury. If they think they can scare me off, they better be ready for me to air out who's been visiting whose wife on Tuesday nights." She gave a tired half-smile. "We'll manage. We're weeds, Tab. You can cut us down, but we grow right back." Sienna stared into her whiskey, seeing a stranger reflected there, a woman with ragged hair, a bruised throat, and a gaze sharper than the knife that had cut her braid. "I can't stay," she whispered. "Even if they don't hang me, I can't walk these streets with their eyes on me. They'll always see the rope." "And I can't stay," Varrik said from the window. He parted the curtain just enough to watch the street. "The way they're looking at me, it's not like I'm a dog anymore. They're turning the moment into a legend, the Apache who shot the gun from a man's hand." He shook his head. "I don't want to be a legend. Legends are easy to shoot. Where will you go?" Crow Reddick asked. North Varrik answered. Toward the Canadian River. Grass is good, land is wide. Not many folks. Sienna lifted her eyes. North, she echoed. Not a question. Not quite agreement. More like a direction she already felt tugging at her bones. They spent the afternoon gathering what they'd need. Riva packed saddlebags with jerky flour coffee and a thick wool blanket. Crow cleaned the raw rope burns at Sienna's neck and brushed salve over the tender skin. It'll scar, he warned gently. Sienna touched the fresh bandage. Good. I'd rather remember. As the sun sank, smearing the sky with angry strokes of orange and purple-blue, Crow appeared at the back door. He brought Varrik's roan and a second mount, a rangy mare, with a white blaze he'd seized during the chaos. The way is open, Blue Crow said in his own tongue, which Varrik translated. But we shouldn't linger. The snake is wounded, but its poison still runs in these people. He wouldn't travel with them. His path bent toward the scattered bands of the Emberthorn Apache. He clasped Varrik's forearm, hard, brief, final, then slipped into the alley like smoke in moonlight. Sienna and Varrik mounted. Riva stepped onto the porch. She pressed a small wrapped bundle into Sienna's hands, a comb and a mirror. You don't owe vanity anything, Riva murmured, but you deserve to see who you've become. Thank you, Sienna said softly, for the gun, for believing me, for the truth. Go on. Riva waved them away, eyes shining. Before I start charging you for the whiskey. They rode out of Larkspur at twilight. They didn't look back at the church. They didn't look back at the parsonage where the untouched roast probably still sat on the table. But they didn't head north, not yet. Varrik guided them along a long, looping path toward the high ridge overlooking the town. Where are we going? Sienna asked, her voice steadier now, finding the horse's rhythm. One last thing, Varrik said. To close the circle. They climbed the shale slope until the charred skeleton of the old signal station came into view, a black tooth silhouetted against the stars. The door still hung barred, the hateful brand still scarred across it. Varrik dismounted. He gathered dead sage and brittle juniper limbs, piling them at the base of the door. It stands as a warning, he said. And as long as it stands, the fear stands with it. This is where they leave their hate. He struck a lucifer match on his boot heel. A sharp flare lit the night. He tossed it into the brush. The fire caught instantly, climbing the door and curling around the carved letters. The old timbers of the station, dry as bone, after years of drought, went up fast, catching like tinder. Sienna Valehart watched the flames rise, heat brushing her face, hotter than all the shame she'd ever carried. She stood silent as the roof sagged inward, collapsing in a burst of sparks, drifting toward the Milky Way. It's gone, she whispered. Varrik Stonehawk stood beside her, the fire staining his dark eyes with flickers of gold. Fire cleanse, he murmured. Now the land can breathe again. Sienna noticed a fallen plank lying outside the blaze, a soot-covered scrap from the old porch rail. She stepped toward it, lifted a cold shard of charcoal from the dirt. What are you doing? Varrik asked. Writing my own name, Sienna replied. She walked to a weather-scarred fence post, one of the few things that would outlast the fire, and pressed the charcoal to the wood. Her strokes were slow and deliberate. She didn't write victim. She didn't write survivor. She didn't write harlot. She wrote one word, chosen. The black letters stood bold against the grain. They said I was taken, Sienna said, turning toward him. Said I was stolen property. But I wasn't taken, Varrik. I chose it. I chose to fight. I chose to live. And I chose you. Varrik looked from the word back to her. The hard calm he wore like armor cracked, letting something soft and fierce show through. "And I chose you," he said quietly, "for all my days." He didn't kiss her. The moment was too sacred for that. Instead, he took her hand, his calloused fingers twining with hers, while the burning station roared behind them, marking the end of something foul in the Dust Haven folks' memory. Down in the valley, they'd see the fire soon enough. They'd wonder if it was Dragan Crowfell's vengeance or God's wrath. They'd never imagine it was simply a woman burying her past. "Let's go home," Sienna said. "We have no home," Varrik reminded her gently. Sienna smiled, and for the first time in years it reached her eyes. She looked out over the prairie wide and wild, under the moon, terrifying and beautiful all at once. "We have the earth," she said softly, "and we have tomorrow. That's enough." They turned their horses toward the North Star. A mountain wind swept down, cold and sharp, smelling of pine and early snow. It was the kind of wind that tore the weak apart. But they were not weak. They were chosen. And as they rode into the dark, the fire behind them burned the last of the lies to ash. The winter of 1876 dropped from the Rockies like a starving wolf testing every timber Varrik had nailed into place. It killed the faint-hearted and hardened anyone left standing. But when the thaw finally came, and the snow bled into the thirsty ground, the cabin by the Canadian River was still there. It wasn't a palace, just cottonwood logs and river clay with a roof that leaked when the east wind shoved rain under the shingles. But it held. Sienna Valehart, though she rarely answered to that formal name anymore, rested an arm on the corral fence, brushing sweat from her brow with a gloved hand. She watched a young mustang circle the ring, eyes rolling white with fear. But Sienna didn't flinch. Standing in the center, a coiled rope in hand, she spoke to the mare in a steady, low hum that cut through the panic. Her buckskin trousers were stained with grease and grass. Her hair, once a spectacle for gossiping tongues hung to her shoulders, now tied back with a leather strip. She no longer looked like the girl who nearly fainted over a ruined Sunday roast. She looked like the land itself, scarred, seasoned alive. Varrik was up on the smokehouse roof, hammering down a loose shingle. He paused, watching her move. She wasn't forcing the mustang, she was guiding it, reading it. She'd learned the prairie's language faster than he ever expected. She could hit a rabbit at 50 paces with the Winchester he'd given her. She could stitch a wound without her hands trembling. She could ride 10 hours straight without one complaint. But more than that, Varrik Stonehawk had been learning too. He glanced down at the hammer in his hand. For most of his life, those hands had carried weapons, bows, lances, Colts, knives. He knew how to end things. He knew how to break what stood in his way. But here on this quiet bend of the river, where the willows dragged their fingers in the water, he was learning something different. He was learning what it meant to build, to find a kind of honor in coaxing corn out of stubborn dirt, or fixing a hinge so a door held firm against a prairie wind. He climbed down the ladder boots, thudding onto packed earth, and walked toward the corral, resting his forearms on the top rail. "She's stubborn," he said, nodding at the young mare. "She's scared," Sienna Valehart corrected, never taking her eyes off the horse. "She thinks the rope means a trap. I have to show her it means connection." With a soft flick of her wrist, the lariat loop drifted over the mare's neck. The horse reared, but Sienna stepped forward, giving slack instead of fighting. The mustang settled, blowing out a long, confused breath. "Connection," Varrik repeated under his breath. A strange word for a world that usually ran on conquest. They had built more than a cabin out here. They'd built a law, one not written on paper, not backed by a sheriff's star, but spoken around a fire the first night they slept in the finished cabin. No chains, No blood debts. If you eat, you work. If you stay, you are family. And somehow the lost had begun to find them. It started 3 months earlier when a wagon limped into their valley with a snapped axle dragging through the dirt. The driver was a black man named Silas, a former Buffalo soldier who'd grown tired of shooting tribes the government wouldn't even let him sit beside. His wife, Sarah, a white woman from Missouri, carried eyes that had seen the ugliest parts of hatred. They'd been driven out of 3 towns. They were starving. Varrik had ridden out to meet them, his hand resting on his gun, but he didn't draw. He recognized the way Silas stood in front of his wife, ready to die protecting her. He'd seen that look before. Now Silas was down by the river, checking fish traps, while Sarah knelt in the garden with a young boy, showing him how to pull weeds between the squash vines. The boy, barely 12, was an orphan they'd found shivering in a root cellar of a ghost town far to the east. He barely spoke, flinched at loud sounds, but he'd stopped hiding food in his pockets. And then there was Lucas, the man fighting to stop drinking. He'd stumbled into their camp half dead, shaking with delirium tremens. Sienna had nursed him through the sweating and the screaming nights. Now he was the one splitting logs behind the cabin, the steady thwack, thwack, thwack of his axe beating like the pulse of their little community. They were broken pieces somehow fitting together into a rough, stubborn mosaic. "A rider's coming?" Varrik said suddenly. Sienna stiffened. She dropped the rope and climbed the fence in one fluid motion, reaching for the rifle leaning against the post. Old habits didn't die. They waited. A lone rider usually meant trouble. They watched the figure approach along the river road. The mount was old, a mule-eared cob that looked one breath from buckling. The rider slumped in the saddle, wrapped in a coat worn thin by miles of dust and cold. As he drew closer, Sienna lowered her rifle. "It's my father," she said quietly. Varrik did not relax. He remembered the man who had stood on the gallows platform condemning his own daughter. "Do you want me to turn him away?" he asked. "No," Sienna said. "Let him come." Father Oren Valehart looked 20 years older than the day he'd loosened his collar in the Dusthaven Square. Deep regret carved his face into something weary and hollow. He reined in the horse and took in the small homestead, the smoke rising from the chimney. Silas and Sarah laughing softly by the river, and the native warrior standing beside his daughter, not as captor, but as equal. He dismounted stiffly. He did not carry a Bible. He carried a small sack of grain. Sienna. He said her true name, spoken gently without the thunder of his old sermons. "Hello, Father," Sienna replied. She didn't embrace him. That bridge was still being built, stone by heavy stone. "You look tired," she said. "I am," Oren answered. "Heart tired. I left the church, or rather the church left me. They wanted a man who could preach fire without burning himself. I could no longer do that." He held out the sack. "Peach stones," he said, "from the tree beside the old church. The soil here looked good." It was a peace offering, an unspoken admission that this wide, untamed stretch of country was her home now. "Thank you," Sienna Valehart said, taking the sack. "You can water the horse, Father, and then you can eat. But you're chopping wood for the fire tonight." That's the rule. Father Oren Valehart glanced at the axe Lucas was using. Then he looked down at his own soft hands, hands that had only ever turned the thin pages of Scripture. He nodded slowly. "I can chop wood," he said. "I'd like to learn to be useful." He stayed 3 days. He did not try to bring her back. He did not pray over meals unless someone asked. Most of all, he watched. He watched Varrik Stonehawk teaching the orphan boy how to read a deer's trail. He watched Sienna deliver a calf in the middle of a freezing night, covered in muck and triumph. He watched the way she and Varrik looked at one another, a look so quietly deep and so whole that the Reverend had to turn away ashamed of the hollow marriages he had blessed for money and convenience. On the morning he left, he handed Sienna a letter from Riva Bramble. "She gave this to me in town," Oren said. "She said you'd want to know." Sienna waited until he was nothing but a fading speck on the horizon before opening it. She sat on the porch, Varrik sitting a step below her, whittling a cedar stick. "Dear Sienna, the town is quiet. Dragan Crowfell's trial was a farce, just like we expected. His lawyers from back east argued he was a businessman protecting his investments. He got 5 years in federal prison, but everyone knows he'll be out in 2. Still, he won't set foot in Dusthaven again. His hand is ruined. He can't hold a gun, and a man who can't hold a gun in Texas is nothing but a mouth." Riva Sienna folded the letter and looked toward the river. She pictured Dragan Crowfell sitting in a cell somewhere. She remembered the fear he once held over her life. "I need to write back," she said. She went inside and found her pen and ink. The paper was coarse, traded from a trapper for a slab of bacon. She wrote quickly, words flowing from a certainty she'd never had in the parsonage. "Dear Riva, do not trouble yourself over Dragan. He belongs to the past. We're building something different here. Our roof only leaks on bad nights, and we've got enough venison to last the winter. My father visited. He's trying to become a man instead of a monument. It's hard for him, but he's trying. You once asked what it felt like to run away. Riva, I didn't run away. I ran toward something. I used to think freedom was only the absence of a cage. I thought it meant being alone. I was wrong. Freedom starts the moment you stop asking permission to breathe. It begins the moment you look at the horizon and don't see a wall, only a question you get to answer. Visit us in the spring. The peach trees might be sprouting. Sienna." That evening, the wind settled, leaving the air crisp and smelling faintly of cedar smoke. The others had gone to sleep in the bunkhouse they'd raised. Varrik and Sienna sat by the fire in the main cabin. Firelight flickered across the log walls, throwing long shadows that wavered like restless spirits. Sienna was sewing a button on Varrik's shirt, a simple domestic thing. Once she had done tasks like that for her father. But this felt different. She wasn't mending the uniform of a man playing a role. She was caring for the man himself. Varrik watched her hands. "Your father," he murmured. "He chopped well enough, but he blistered fast." "He'll toughen up," Sienna said, biting the thread. "Or he won't come back. That part's up to him." "Choice," Varrik said softly. "It's a heavy thing to carry." "It's the only thing worth carrying," she replied. She handed him the shirt. He didn't put it on. Instead, he tossed it onto the chair beside them and reached for her hand. His grip was warm, rough-skinned, steady. He drew her gently from the chair until she knelt between his legs on the braided hearth rug. He studied her face. He traced the faint white scar on her neck where the rope had once burned her. It was fading, but it would never disappear entirely. "In my people's way," Varrik said quietly, "when a man and woman join, there are gifts, horses, blankets, feasts." Sienna smiled. "And we already ate the feast for dinner." "I have no horses to give you," Varrik said, his voice solemn. "No land the government recognizes, a name that half the territory spits at." He leaned forward. His forehead rested gently against hers. "But I do have something," Varrik Stonehawk murmured. "Every dawn I open my eyes, the sky is wide, the wind is sharp, and I could choose any direction. I could ride into the mountains. I could cross into Mexico." Sienna Valehart's breath snagged in her chest. "You could," she whispered. But I don't, he said, voice low as a heartbeat. I stay. Not because snow blocks the trails, not for the walls of this cabin. I stay because you are here. He lifted his gaze to hers, and in the firelight she saw a truth carved deeper than bone. I don't need a church paper, he told her softly. I don't need some judge to tell me where I belong. When I look at you, I see my ground. He brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. You once said I'd ruin your life, he murmured, the hint of a smile at the edge of his mouth. You did, she whispered back, eyes burning. You ruined the girl who lived in fear. You killed her, good, Varrik said. I don't want the frightened girl. I want the woman who set fire to the past. He kissed her. Not like the wild, desperate storm kiss in the canyon, but slow, steady, full of the smoke and promise of tomorrow. A kiss that rooted her to the earth and tethered her to him. I chose you. Varrik breathed against her lips, sealing a vow stronger than any ring. I chose you. Forever. Outside, the river kept cutting its path through stone. Coyotes lifted their voices to the moon, not as a warning, but as a welcome. Inside the cabin, a log cracked in the fire, sending a spark spiraling up the chimney to join the stars. The storm had passed. The bough had held. And in the fierce heart of a wild country, two souls had found the only thing that could endure winter, the will to remain. 2 years later, spring hit the town of Larkspur with a fury. Heavy rains had washed the last streaks of soot from the ruins of the old signal station on the ridge. The town was different now. Dragan Crowfell was gone. Spoken of only in lowered voices, a bedtime threat to scare children. Jackson Thornwright sat in a jail cell. A new sheriff wore the badge, a man who walked instead of strutted. Up on the ridge where the gallows had once stood, the charred beams had collapsed into the earth, returning to soil. Yet the ground wasn't bare. From the ashes of hate, wildflowers had erupted bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, their colors bursting across the scarred land like a declaration. They covered the place where the rope once swung. They grew over the blackened remnants of the burned door. A hawk circled overhead, calling into the thin spring air. It looked down on the blossoms rippling in the wind. Nothing of the violence remained, only the relentless insistence of life pushing upward toward the sun. The rope was gone. The flowers remained. And far to the north, where the river ran wide and untamed, a thin column of smoke rose from a chimney, quiet proof that the chosen had found their home. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.